Hello, my name is Andrew Gregory, and I would like, if I may, to take a few minutes of your time to talk about the unfolding story of what I've managed to find out about my grandfather, Sidney Gregory. I never met Sidney. He died in 1953, the year before I was born. And in fact, I've only ever met two or three individuals who would have known him personally. And yet, strangely, I know more about Sidney than I do about any of my other ancestors who are infinitely easier to research. When I was 16, an aunt of mine decided out of the blue to tell me something about her father, my grandfather. What she said was that he was a gypsy and a Mountie, and that whilst in Canada he had had a son with the same forename as my father, Howard. But I wasn't quite sure what to make of these three challenges. Gypsies, to my 16-year-old mind, would have been almost like mythical characters, probably disreputable, and I probably wouldn't have wanted to have met one. Mounties sounded all right. And this thing about another son called Howard, was this supposed to imply that Sidney had been a bigamist, or that there was some yet to be discovered parallel family living in Canada? Those challenges set me off really on 40 years of family history research, on and off, mainly off. And in fact, a lot of what that aunt told me has at least some element of truth to it. Sidney certainly was a gypsy, and living in a tent, was picked up by Bernardos in 1888 and taken to Canada. Once there, in a town called Midland in Ontario, he worked for 15 years in the lumbering industry, both chopping trees down and working in sawmills. But by the turn of the 20th century, the trees had virtually gone, and so Sidney would have turned his hand to the engineering works that were in Ontario, on the Georgian Bay, which is where Midland is, and eventually, by 1904, took himself off to San Francisco to work in the Union Iron Works, shipbuilding. He was a boilermaker. Now that would have meant that he was in San Francisco in 1906 when the earthquake hit the town. By 1917 he was applying to join the First World War, and he would have gone from Los Angeles, where he registered, to Montreal, and then some training in Canada with the Canadian Field Engineers before coming to England. He actually ended up in the Royal Engineers, and I actually think, because he actually signed up so late in the August of 1917, that probably his training would have meant that he never actually went to war. A month or two after his discharge in 1919, he married my grandmother. She already had two illegitimate children, and they had two more together. And when she died in 1927, he was completely unable to look after the family, and they all had to go into a cottage home for destitute children. And eventually in 1953, Sidney died a homeless vagrant. Lots of people, I think, when they are talking about ancestors who were sent to Canada, paint a picture of a life of abuse, perhaps even of slavery. I have this funny feeling that as far as Sidney was concerned, his life in Canada and the USA were probably the best years of his life. And in some senses, that's why I'm very much interested in this process, to get some professional help in trying to find out some of the unanswered questions I have about what happened to Sidney.